Okay, Uncle Jamal, Jamal
Yes,
Mubdi-Bey.
I'm here.
To all of our listening audience, we are live on Facebook and we are live on YouTube, and we are going to get started in 1 minute. So hold your horses and buckle up for what is sure to be an outstanding discussion, a race toward democracy, an African American journey with Mr. Jamal Mubdi Bey. Just sit tight, hold your horses, share the links with your family and friends on YouTube and Facebook, Instagram, because this recording and conversation is sure to knock your socks off. We are talking to one of the legends of the Black Power movement, former Marine out of Baltimore, Maryland, an elder, a man who has seen it all from the early days of Jim Crow to the days of stopping the steal and the big lie. Jamal Moody Bay from Baltimore, Maryland. He's in his seat. He's written his thesis, which is in the chat room. If you click on that link, my goodness gracious, you are in store for a perspective like no other on the race toward democracy, an African American perspective. Jamal Mubdi Bey, the brother of the good Dr. Charles Simmons, founder of Sojourner Douglas College in Baltimore, Maryland. So just sit tight. We're about to get started. I think our guest is here. And as soon as I get the signal from our chief operating officer, digital producer, we will go. Let's go. One, two, three. Here we go. Okay. My name is Dr. Julius G. Johnson. I am the founder of the Newberry Institute located in Hawkinsville, Georgia. Uh, we at the Newberry Institute are committed to democracy. And today we have a special guest, Mr. Jamal Moody Bey. This democracy talk happens once a month where we invite guests from across the world to come and share their perspective. This talk is sponsored again by the Newberry Institute, located in Hawkinsville, Georgia. We have an extraordinary team: Kim Akuyama, Danielle, Amina Salim, the Chief Financial Officer, Mr. Kevin, the digital producer, and our extraordinary board of directors,
Kim.
huh?
Kim.
And of course, Kim, which I mentioned. And we are sponsored by the Center for Common Ground, headed by the extraordinary Andrea Miller. So let us get started. Tonight's talk is titled A Race Toward Democracy. And I'm interested in knowing, has the race toward democracy for African Americans in particular, has it been a marathon, a sprint, a tag team, stops and starts? How are we to understand the African American journey toward democracy? Well, today we've got a man in the booth. His name is Mr. Jamal Mubdi Bey. He's an elder, a statesman. He's lived through so much of America's history, going to the Marine Corps in the 1950s, coming out of the Marine Corps into a society where the Black Power movement and the Civil Rights movement was budding. So many forces shaping his young world. And he made decisions. He decided to get involved. And today, at more than 80 years old, his mind is as sharp as a razor. His analysis is crisp. He's a critical thinker. He's a participant and activist, a revolutionary. Here he is for all of you to listen and learn about the life, the times, and the perspective of the one and only Mr. Jamal Mubdi-Bey, coming to us live from Baltimore, Maryland. Brother Jamal, are you there, my brother?
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm happy to be here with you.
Outstanding. You're looking great. You're looking great, Mr. Jamal Mubdi-Bey. Let's get right into this discussion, which I'm so excited to have with you. And again, we're broadcasting live on YouTube and Facebook and all of social media. Who knows who's tuning in? So why don't we start, Jamal Mubdi-Bey, with some of your early experiences and influences that led to your activism. You were born where, and help us out.
I was born in Baltimore, Maryland, actually, and I grew up in a place called the Edgar Allan Poe Homes. This was a one of the complexes that the city set up for, I mean, we're talking during a very segregated period. So the projects, as we called them, were segregated. It was all black families that lived in the Edgar Allan Poe homes. There were criteria that qualified folks who could, in fact, some of my contemporaries who didn't live in public housing, but, we were middle class. Of course, we were not middle class, but because the projects, the condition was pretty adequate. The housing stock was steady. The all of the systems worked. Unlike some of my neighbors and friends who lived close but not in public housing, we had indoor plumbing, we had heat, didn't have air, but we were in much, I would say, comparatively speaking, in housing that was adequate, especially when you compared it to some of our friends and neighbors who had public housing. Some of them had outdoor plumbing, in fact. Some of
Oh,
them
I see.
had
So,
wood burning stoves for heat.
okay, exactly. So I see that you're making the point that you were in public up. I guess this was in the 1940s in Baltimore,
Yeah, I
Maryland.
was born in
So
1941. 41.
1940, 1941. And so the housing was subsidized housing. I'm sure there was a criteria. Your parents were married, both of your parents or one of your parents were working, your siblings were in school. You guys had dinner at the table together, you played baseball. Sounds like there was stability in your early childhood. Is that right?
Yes, yes, absolutely. The projects was like a village, actually, the proverbial village, where, we knew everyone, everyone knew each other. We were like family, actually. Parents felt free to chastise other children that may not have been their own if they
Okay,
saw them, out of line. So it was
fantastic.
a
So there
very
was,
close knit neighborhood.
it sounds like there was a close-knit neighborhood. One might even call it a community that was healthy, where people knew each other. And so, where did you go to school? growing up? What are some of the schools you attended?
I went to, well, my elementary school started at a place called, it was school number 110, old school. In fact, there was a sign on the front of the school that called it 110 Colored School.
Okay,
So
110 Colored School. Okay.
yes, and that school I went from kindergarten to the third grade. By then, they had built a new school called Fanny L. Barber 161, which was in the neighborhood, not in the projects, but in the neighborhood. And I went
Okay.
there through elementary school. Then I left elementary school. I went to um, Booker T. Washington Junior High School
Booker
for
T. Washington Junior
Booker
High
T.
School. Now
Washington.
that's quite a name. Now just quickly, Booker T. Washington was who? Very quickly,
Booker
for
T.
those who may not
Washington
know.
was a black leader who actually uh, was one of the black leaders of our before my time, actually. But he had to do with founding Tuskegee. He was considered a very moderate black man who, in some cases, was looked down on by some of my, in my adult life, some of my more radical friends who considered Booker T. Washington and his moderate politics as an Uncle Tom.
I see.
Of course,
Okay,
everybody didn't see Booker T that way, of course,
exactly. And of course,
and I didn't
Tuskegee,
see him that way.
right? And of course,
And
and
but
of
he
course,
was definitely a very prominent black leader of his day, and
oh, absolutely,
is very respected today in many
absolutely.
quarters.
And then
So
after
that's
Booker
my
T,
junior high school. I
right?
left junior high school. I went to Frederick Douglass Senior High School, which was
Frederick
one of the,
Douglass.
yeah, Frederick Douglass, one of the three high schools for black students in Baltimore during that time. There were only three. And
Now,
it
now,
was,
now, hold on. Hold on. You've mentioned Frederick Douglass. Now, before we move forward, just for the audience, our younger people who may not know who Frederick Douglass was, could you say one or two things about Frederick Douglass?
yes, Frederick Douglass was a very, very prominent, highly respected black man, black leader, who actually was born in slavery. And Frederick Douglass was actually, when he escaped slavery, he lived in Baltimore. He was a Baltimorean, actually, in his early life. But he was an activist. He was an ardent campaigner for civil rights for black people.
I think he was
Um,
also an abolitionist, correct? He was an
Definitely
abolitionist.
an abolitionist and a speaker. He spoke all over the world, on behalf of black people. And
Now, hold on, Uncle
today,
Jamal. Hold on, Mr. Jamal. Hold on. You're moving fast, but we mentioned the term abolitionist. Could you just define what that was for those who may not know? He was an abolitionist, meaning what?
abolitionists were those people who were against enslavement. So he was a prominent speaker against enslavement all of his life. As I said, he was born in slavery, but he escaped slavery and became highly educated, very intelligent, uh, eloquent speaker, and he spoke to large audiences all over the world throughout his life. So yes, he
Exactly.
was an abolitionist. He was a
Exactly.
prominent speaker against enslavement of Africans.
Exactly. And then after your education at Frederick Douglass, where'd you go?
Well, I graduated from high school in 1959, and I immediately,
1959.
yes, 1959, at a very interesting time in America. I followed my two older brothers into the Marine Corps. I joined the Marine Corps in July. I left Baltimore and went to Parris Island, South Carolina, for my what they call boot camp
Well, hold
in
on. Hold
Parris
on.
Island, South Carolina.
Right. Well, hold on. Before we move forward on this race toward democracy and African American perspective, could you give us a sense of what was going on in America and the world in 1959? Who was the president? Who was the governor of Maryland? What were some of the hot button issues in 1959?
Well, first of all, you have to understand that coming up in a segregated city like Baltimore, I was basically limited in who and how diverse my connections and the associates. I didn't actually have the close connection or proximity to white people until I went into the Marine Corps. All of my schooling, early schooling, was black schools.
Okay, so it was segregated. So the point
Absolutely
you're making
segregated.
is that okay, it was during the days of segregation. Okay, so who was the
Yes.
president in 1959 when you went off to
If
the
I'm not
Marine Corps?
mistaken, I think
Was it President Truman? It was after
well,
FDR.
I'm look, I'm not sure that maybe Truman was the president in '59, but Eisenhower, I remember Eisenhower as one of the presidents, coming up as a young person, and yeah, maybe it was um, President Truman in '59, and don't get me to try to remember the succession of presidents after that. But nevertheless,
It was segregated. You grew up in a segregated city, Baltimore. We think President Truman may have been the president. What was the tenor and tone and mood of the country as you came of age in 1959 as an African American in Baltimore?
well, think about the early stages of the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement. Early stages of the civil rights movement. I remember, what happened to many of the demonstrations that were occurring especially in the more southern. I mean, Maryland is a southern state. A lot of people may not realize that, but more southern states had demonstrations were beginning against segregation and against Jim Crow, uh, especially in places below Maryland, in Virginia, in North Carolina, and South Carolina. Um, so the tenor was beginning to challenge. Black people were beginning to challenge Jim Crow in that early period. The student sit-ins in North Carolina and South Carolina and Alabama, um, the the prominence of the Ku Klux Klan and church bombings were occurring in various locations around the country. children were being shut out of school because of um, the effort to desegregate and to open up schools to black people, open up white schools which were heavily resisted. And so this is what was occurring during that period, when, I was around 18 years old and went into the United States Marine Corps and had my first early experiences of with white people, because prior to that, most of my connections and interactions were with other black people.
Right
So I had
now,
my first interaction with white people when I went into the Marine Corps.
right, and so this is really exciting. So it sounds like things were heating up. Protests were taking place. Levels of consciousness amongst African Americans was increasing. Sounds like you're talking about organizations taking their place in history to bring about change and progress. Now, this movement, this effort to toward democracy, it was an integrated movement. Would you say it was an integrated movement? Was it a segregated movement? Was it within the framework and guardrails of the democratic process? The approach.
Well, on some of the college campuses, there was some integration. There was some liberal white folks who joined black students, sitting in at restaurants that were segregated, challenging their segregation policies in various places, including right here in Baltimore. There were sit-ins and students. In some cases, they were integrated, but for the most part, they were black students that were leading the charge, challenging Jim Crow laws around the country. So,
Let me stop you there before we talk about you going into the Marines, because I think it warrants an explanation. So when we talk about challenging Jim Crow laws, when you talk about the Black Power movement and the Civil Rights movement, what were the goals and objectives of these efforts concretely? What was success with respect to, for example, the civil rights movement in particular?
well, I think primarily black folks were looking for equal justice under the law. Black
Okay.
people were expecting to be treated fairly, in education, in housing, in all of the systems of this country, where black folks had been shut out or um, unequally treated. So to break those barriers was the primary objective of the civil rights movement,
So
to
for
be
exactly.
treated equally under the law, basically.
So equal treatment under the law, and justice and equality, and which leads me to, for example, the founding of the NAACP, the National Advancement for Colored People. A prominent advocate was Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, the first doctoral African American to receive a doctorate degree at Harvard University, was a prominent member, of course, founder of the Crisis magazine, was very much a part of that early civil rights effort. And of course, what happened in 1954? This is 5 years before you went to the Marine Corps with the good Justice Marshall on the Supreme Court.
Yes. What was your question?
The famous case, the Brown versus Board of Education.
Yes,
which determined that separate is inherently unequal, and that
correct.
Supreme Court decision laid the foundation for what would eventually be desegregation of schools. And this is in 1954. So we're seeing this race toward democracy sort of gaining some momentum by the time you're heading off to the Marine Corps in 1959. So let's get to the Marine Corps. I mean, the Marines, I mean, the proud Marines, I mean, probably the most elite section of the United States Armed Services, a Marine. They never leave anybody behind. And you from Baltimore, Maryland, Jamal Mubdi-Bey, a veteran of the Corps, what on God's earth led you to the Marine Corps to be one of the few, one of the chosen, one of the brave?
Well, joining the armed forces was one of the options that black folks at that point considered.
Yeah.
And my two older brothers had already joined the Marine Corps. My oldest brother, Floyd, went in 1954, and my next oldest brother, Charles, went in 1957, I believe, maybe
Wow.
1956 or 57. And
Wow.
so I followed them. I went in 1959, 18 years old, just graduated high school, and it was an eye opener.
Well, hold on. Before you take us to the eye-opening experience, how did your community react to you being accepted into the Corps? Were you respected? Were you honored? Were you recognized for your service? Because of course, we had African Americans participating in earlier efforts from the Tuskegee Airmen, the Union soldiers, we served in the Revolutionary War. So there was a long tradition of, remember Christmas Addicts, the Revolutionary War veteran, the first to be shot. I think it was at Bunker Hill, if I'm not mistaken. So there was a long history of African Americans' participation in armed services. But how did your community, how did it feel to be a Marine in the Edgar Allan Poe homes in Baltimore, Maryland, when you were heading off to serve?
Well, it was very respected, actually. Black folks considered serving in the military an honor, and and it garnered significant respect among my contemporaries. So, in spite of all of the shortcomings, I can say without hesitation that my contemporaries had a great deal of respect for men who served in the armed forces. And of
Well, hold on.
course,
Let me ask you this. Can you give our listening audience a sense of what kind of pay did you get? What were the benefits? What were some of the incentives that drew you to the Corps? Do you remember your salary, for example? Did you get health insurance? Did you get housing? That kind of thing. Education, training.
well, the pay it that's not what was the attractive thing. I mean, it was like I would say probably commensurate with minimum wage in that day. Um, but you lived, you had all of the benefits, health benefits and regular pay. So that was beneficial and but not the main attraction. Being in the service was respected. It was respected. It took, number one, it took you off the streets from, the kind of thing that a lot of my contemporaries were doing who didn't go into the service were getting in trouble. So So it was an honorable way to transition, into adulthood. And, there were many benefits that were not necessarily monetary, but even then, minimum wage and a steady minimum wage, was better than a lot of folks that did not go into the military were receiving.
Exactly. So
So
let me ask you this. So you were you political by the time you entered the Corps, or that came later?
that came later, but not much later, because my politicization began in the Marine Corps.
Okay,
When
this is what I want to get into now. I want to get into the politicization of Mr. Jamal Mubdi-Bey. Now, when you went into the Corps, may I ask you what was your name? What was your government name, as the brothers say?
I was Private Joseph Vernon Simmons when I went into the Marine Corps. And I had my first experience with racism head on. Of course, coming up in a segregated city, I didn't have many occasions to interact with white people, so I wasn't directly exposed to racism and its ugliness coming up until I
And
went into the Marine Corps.
okay, so let's talk about that a little bit. Are you talking about the Corps itself, or are you talking about other Marines who, like you, hadn't been brought up with people who were different than they were? Just want to be clear about that.
Well, it's difficult for me to distinguish between the Corps itself and the contemporaries who I was interacting with.
Well, when
To
you
me,
think about it like this. When we talk about the core, we're talking about the training, the benefits, the opportunities, the values, the measurable indicators to determine equality, the courts, the tribunals, the discharges, the recruitment efforts, the opportunities for different service, in the opportunities, that sort of thing, which is sort of the core. And then, of course, you had individuals' behavior, which, of course, the Marines certainly can't be held responsible for, at least not on the onset.
well, listen, Julius, making that distinction is very difficult because my
Okay.
intimate connection with the Marine Corps was with contemporary fellow Marines,
Okay.
mostly enlisted men,
Okay.
but to a lesser extent, officers, non-commissioned officers, and of course, to an even lesser extent, full officers. So my intimate connection with the Marine Corps was through fellow Marines,
Okay.
men that I, you know, lived with and slept with in barracks,
Did you did you guys sleep?
trained with,
Did
men.
did the Black Marines and the White Marines sleep in the same barracks, or was it
Yes,
segregated?
yes, no, the barracks were not segregated at that point.
What about the
The barracks were
cafeteria?
integrated. But listen, integrated in my platoon, I think a platoon of about 75 men, there were 7 black men,
Okay.
including myself.
Okay.
And of course, because of racism and because of the racist behavior of the majority of the men who we were, in close proximity with, the blacks stayed together and the whites stayed together. So
Right.
it was still segregated basically.
I
And
see.
let me tell you, when I when I had 7 black, you know, soldiers who were in my platoon. I had there were what? How many instructors? There might have been 4 or 5 drill instructors, all of whom were white.
Right.
And after my early experience in the Marine Corps, like boot camp and advanced so-called advanced infantry training at a place called Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. Then we went to um, our assignment. So
Okay.
I ended up traveling to a place called Okinawa. I know you've heard of that.
Yeah. Okinawa,
And
Japan.
in Okinawa, well, it's an island off Japan. In Okinawa, guess what? It was as much racism there, even among the Okinawans. The when Marines had an opportunity to have what they call liberty, going off the base into the civilian population, there was still segregation in that area. There was a place where mostly black Marines would go and places where they would not go. Or not that they could not go, but they were not welcoming places to go. They were only welcoming to white Marines. So you're not escaping, even though you're in a foreign land, you're not escaping the racism and segregation that was so prominent in this country.
I
So
see.
and that was a sort of a rude awakening. There were incidents that would occur that were of a racial nature. Fights with black Marines and white Marines. So I continued to encounter um, racism. It
I
was
see.
everywhere. It was
I,
everywhere.
so this is now the beginning of your political astuteness. You start confronting some of the challenges within the Marine Corps. So I take it you got an honorable discharge and
Yes,
return
yes.
and return and return to Baltimore, and then you changed your name. You changed your name from
Well, that happened.
from
That didn't happen right away.
that didn't happen
By the
right away,
time
but you
I got back, by the time I got back to Baltimore, obviously the struggle had was heating up considerably.
okay, so let's talk about that.
So
So the race toward democracy is heating up. You're in Baltimore, Maryland. So this is what you're coming into as a Marine. So how were you received with your uniform as a Marine coming into the heat of the movement toward
well,
democracy?
let's understand that by then, when I got back to Baltimore, I was discharged in 1963. From
Okay.
59 to 63, I spent 4 years in the Marine Corps. So I didn't bring a uniform back. I came back as a civilian who was very much different from who I was when I went in. So all of my experiences only helped to radicalize me. When I came back to Baltimore, the student demonstrations had morphed into widespread conflicts. Um, you know, not just what was going on in the southern cities of confronting Jim Crow laws, but I came back more radical than I went in. So there was like two tracks to the movement that was occurring when I got back to Baltimore. One was what they called the civil rights movement. The other was what they called the Black Power movement. And of course, my experiences in the Marine Corps radicalized me to the point where I lean more to the Black Power movement than to the civil rights movement. I
Now
was
hold on a
appreciative.
second.
I was appreciative of both, but
Yes.
my commitment was more to the radical side than the peaceful.
Yeah.
Um, uh, you know, I guess I don't want to characterize the civil rights movement in a negative light, but I was more favorable to the Black Power movement than the civil rights
Were
movement.
were the objectives different in this race toward democracy between the two movements?
Well, I think the objectives were different in that the radical movement kind of eschewed, um, you know, peaceful approaches, were more interested in self-defense and protecting oneself rather than, peaceful demonstrations and not having the right to be self empowered and take a posture of self defense. So I think that if anything that differentiated the two, it's that.
Would you say the two movements are sort of humanly encapsulated in the personalities and political leanings of Dr. Martin Luther King on the civil rights movement side, who was loved and hated uh, by people, and Malik El Haj Shabazz, otherwise known as Malcolm X, who would represent, for example, the Black Power movement, who was also loved and hated by many, and both, of course, were tragically assassinated. Would you say that's accurate?
Absolutely accurate. Yes, indeed.
And
Those
okay,
were
so
those two characters that you just mentioned were symbols of the two sides of the movement.
right, and so of course, like you were more drawn to, as you said, the Black Power movement, where you were radicalized. I'm wondering, what was it about the Black Power movement that you felt was a faster race toward democracy? Was democracy the objective? Did anybody talk about democracy in the Black Power movement? Were you using democratic means to voice your opinion, to organize, to mobilize?
Well,
Or were you going outside?
democracy as an objective was not that prominent, even among the radicals that I associated with. It wasn't so much democracy as it was manhood. Being able to protect your family, being able to demonstrate the ability to be a human. So it wasn't like democracy the way it is now,
No, but
under
I'm,
attack.
but what's interesting is in the Black Power movement, as you said, there was a heavy emphasis on protection and self-defense. So of course, I'm thinking of the Black Panther Party, founded by the late Huey P. Newton and Eldridge Cleaver and Bobby Seale and others, Angela
Right,
Davis. Um, uh, and they, of course, were armed, bearing individuals who were registered gun owners exercising the Second Amendment, which is a right, an illustration of democracy So while democracy may not have been on the lips of people, it sounds like they were exercising democratic spaces to protect themselves, at least with respect to bearing arms. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would agree with that. But look at the backlash. Look at the resistance against. Look at what happened to the Panthers, who absolutely were attempting to express their Second Amendment rights. Look at how they were demolished by the government of this country.
Well,
So,
hold on. Well,
you
let's
know,
let's 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 talk about that. Let's talk about that. And I think in the paper that you wrote, which was phenomenal, I think you wrote maybe 15 or 16 pages of your perspective on some of these issues, which we're putting in the chat for our listening audience to read later. Let's talk about the government's reaction both to the civil rights movement as well as to the Black Power movement. I'm thinking of Fred Hampton, for example. I'm thinking of some of the surveillance that took place. But I think you talked about COINTELPRO, if I'm not mistaken, headed by um, uh,
J. Edgar Hoover.
J. Edgar Hoover. Tell us a little bit about the late Attorney General J. Edgar Hoover and COINTELPRO as we talk about Black people with their white counterparts hand in hand racing toward democracy.
Well, let me tell you, J. Edgar Hoover was. I, it's hard for me to even describe this person who clearly, in my estimation, was a criminal. He established a program. They called it the COINTELPRO, which was anti everything black, anything that attempted to demand equal protection under the law.
So was it
He
was
was,
COINTEL was it counterintelligence program? I think that was
yes,
the
yes, that, I
the
think that's
full
what,
name.
yes, I think that's the correct term, but it was shortened to COINTEL. Um, and yes, it was counter intelligence against any form of not just radicalism, but even the peaceful aspect of the civil rights movement. Um, J. Edgar Hoover was against. So COINTELPRO was designed to disrupt any challenge, any effort of black people or black and white people to challenge Jim Crow laws and the segregation that had been so extant in this country. And
Well. To be fair, I think it's important to set the political context that COINTELPRO operated in, and of course, this was during the time of the bear and the eagle. This is the time of the Great Red Square, the Great Red Scare, and the infiltration of Russian spies and the world really being divided along two lines, one being the United States and its model of development and interest, and one envisioned by the Soviet Union. And both of those superpowers were competing for allies and infiltrating each other's countries. So, would you say that J. Edgar Hoover's one of his concerns was the impact of Russia's Marxist Leninist influence on Americans, and it just so happened that for some of those in the Black Power movement, they had been subjected to some of those teachings and had adhered to some of those practices, and that then led to them being on the watch list.
well, I want to introduce at this point of our discussion the reality of war and what actually was occurring with our country and its love for war. There was actually a general that when I was in the Marine Corps, he was a Marine general. I mean, prior to my period in the Marine Corps, but I never heard his name. His name was General Smedley D. Butler. And Julius, he wrote a book called War is a Racket. This was a man who led American troops during the 20s and 30s when they were establishing American markets abroad. That he talked about. Now, this man was one of the top leaders of the military who actually turned on the military and began to teach about the realities of war and the purposes of war that were hidden. So when you mention the struggles against Russia and, you know, the warlike behavior of both countries, I can't help but think about Smedley D. Butler and his teaching about war is a racket and how war was designed to produce profit for the war machine producers. You name them. Think about some of the companies that produce war machinery, and those are the country behind the companies. I'm sorry, behind the war-making behavior of this country. The Raytheons, the Boeings, you know, the ones who benefit. One of the early radical politicians in this country told the truth when he said, the war started by wealthy people, that poor people fight the wars, rich people start the wars, rich people have everything to gain and nothing to lose, and poor people have nothing to gain and everything to lose, including their lives. So look at war in that perspective, and we will not glorify the behavior of the United States and the so-called Cold War, which was really hot in many places of the world. They called it a Cold War, but that's clearly a misnomer. In Africa, it was very hot. In parts of Asia, it was very hot. People of color who were the fodder of war, of these warring efforts. I think war itself is a crime. You know, the idea that a war crime, to me, that's an oxymoron. So think about the level of, I think about Muhammad Ali, who was one of my greatest of all heroes, who resisted war, resisted going to war, refused to go. In fact, as a professional boxer, the prime of his life was taken from him when he refused to go and kill other people of color on behalf of this war-making machine called America. So when I think about the divisions that you mentioned, I can't help but see them in this light.
Right, so, right. No,
Smedley Butler is my hero. Muhammad Ali is my hero. Malcolm X is my hero. These are the folks who look at America's involvement in war with clear eyes, not with, you know, not through the propagandized image of American war making and love for war. And when we see some of the things that are occurring in this country today, you know, this
Right.
country, the violence that this country was founded on, you know, is reflected in some of the even the black on black violence that goes on, the gun lovers. Uh, in
Absolutely. I am better for it by appreciating your perspective with respect to war and the work of Mr. Smedley's book. And perhaps we can put that in the chat for those who might be interested in learning about war as a racket. But I served in Afghanistan, and I've seen some of our finest boys give their arms and limbs and legs for democracy and freedom. Um, Being in Afghanistan was an extraordinary experience where America really came to the assistance of the Afghan people. Prior to that, of course, we were in Iraq, working to really get rid of a tyrant, Saddam Hussein. We've come to the aid of Europe during World War II to defend democracy when Adolf Hitler's reign, just executed millions of innocent people. America, while one might tilt one's focus to the racket of war, has also been a country that has been a defender of peace. I'm here as we speak in Nairobi, Kenya, where presidential elections are taking place, and Americans are here observing the elections. Our bases around the world, for example, in Taiwan and throughout Europe, our participation in NATO, and really being the defenders of peace. We are the leaders of the world. And so certainly respect our military personnel, our extraordinary military power, which makes it safe for you and I to continue to benefit from the fruits of this great country. So while there is a critique that is legitimate with respect to war, there's certainly much to be proud of. And as you as a former veteran and Marine, I think you exemplify the very best in a critical perspective on our military, but one who nonetheless has served. But I want to turn your attention back to you coming out of the Marines, because I want to get into today with what's going on in our country, because you went through, as you mentioned, a radicalization where you were drawn to the Black Power movement. You changed your name. I think you're one of the early founders of an organization called Black Men's Development, where you had tremendous success in exercising your democratic rights and reforming formerly incarcerated individuals. Can you say a little bit about the Jamal, the man who becomes Jamal Mubdi-Bey, and your participation in the Black Men's Development movement within this context that you found yourself operating in the post-Marine period?
Well, let me say that, you know, my radicalization deepened,
Mm,
continued as I learned how to look past the propaganda that is America. I began to have freedom to study, um, you know, radical thinkers,
mm,
American, some black, some American, some foreign, who were not overtaken by the lies of America. America is
Who?
full of lies, Julius.
Hold on,
Let me say, let me,
hold on, Mr. Jamal Mubdi-Bey. I just love talking with you. You're 80. You certainly have lived an extraordinary life, and you have many years to go. But I want you to mention some of these influencers of your thinking. Would you say Paul Robeson, Noam Chomsky, Frederick Douglass? Who were some of the influencers in your thinking, your political thinking? Elijah
certainly
Muhammad.
all those that you answered, that you just mentioned.
Yeah.
Clearly, Marcus Garvey. Don't forget him.
Marcus Garvey, Marcus
Yes,
Garvey, the
yes,
great Marcus Mosiah Garvey, the founder
yes,
of the United Negro Improvement Association. Up, you mighty
absolutely.
race, may you accomplish what you will. Marcus Mosiah Garvey. Also, so
Elijah
these
Muhammad, Malcolm
Elijah,
X.
Malcolm
Look,
X.
these are people who were uh, who were untouched by the propaganda. And Julius, I can't talk about these issues without talking about deception and the lies and propaganda that undergirds America's um, so-called exceptionalism.
Well, we're going to
So
get to
let me
that.
say that.
We're gonna get to that. We're going to get to that. But could you please share with our audience, how does this Marine, this fine American, brought up in the Edgar Allan Poe homes, turn to Jamal Mubdi-Bey, who's radicalized and wants to participate in the Black Power movement as you marched toward democracy? Tell us
by
about that.
looking by looking at the hypocrisy that is extant in America. The hypocrisy is hard to ignore. When I think about this country's participation in deposing even democratically established governments, like in Haiti. Look at what happened in Haiti and the role that this country played. Look at what happened in South America and
Yeah, yeah,
in
but Uncle Jamal, but Jamal Mukti
so
Bey,
you're asking me,
yes
you're
sir, yes
asking me
sir,
how
yes
did I
sir.
become, you're asking me how did I become radicalized, and I'm giving you the content of my radicalization. How did this happen? By looking at reality and not being coded by propaganda. I
Got it.
can't, I
I
can't,
got,
I can't explain my radicalization
I got
without
it.
talking about the hypocrisy of America.
Well, I got it. But when we talk about America's foreign policy or
Yeah,
America's domestic policy, certainly there are some
full of
shortcomings,
hypocrisy.
but there are
I
also
can't hear you. I can't
there
hear
are
you.
there are also strengths. There are also strengths, and there
Julius,
are
I
also.
can't hear you.
You can't hear me. I'm not sure why you
I
can't hear
can't hear
me.
you.
You can't hear me. I'm not sure why you can't hear me.
You went away. Your voice went away.
I'm
I
not
can see you, but
sure.
I can't hear you.
Can you hear me? What happened? Hello? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Jamal? Mubdi Bey? Did it stop recording?
No,
Jamal Mubdi Bey?
just back in. Hold on.
Hello? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Hello, Jamal Mubdi Bey? Hello, can you hear me now?
Okay, so I can hear you. And I can hear you on here.
Can you hear me now?
He
Jamal
said that he
Mubdi
can hear you.
Bey.
Yeah, we can all hear you.
I think everyone can hear me. I'm not sure if you can hear me or not. Can you hear me?
He can't.
Maybe
I can hear you on YouTube.
maybe your power has gone out, Jamal Mubdi-Bey. I'm not sure if we can assist you in that, but the listening audience can hear me. And so while they are trying to get you back on, I will just say that this is an extraordinary discussion we're having today with Jamal Mubdi-Bey, an elder in Baltimore, Maryland, who was a former Marine in the 1950s and left the Marine Corps and decided to exercise his democratic rights by peacefully protesting as a member
Can you hear me,
of
Julius?
the Black Panther,
Can you hear me?
the Black Power movement.
I can't hear you.
Okay, now
In the
he's-
1960s.
I can't hear you.
Okay, wait. Uncle Jamal? Okay.
Can you hear me now? I'm not sure what's happened, but perhaps our producers can get you back.
Can you hear
plugged
me?
into me. This is out.
Yes, we can hear him.
Hello?
We can hear Uncle Jamal. Okay.
What about this? The microphone seems to have gone out. Uncle Jamal.
Hello?
Yes, can you hear me?
Talk to you. I pulled this out.
Can you hear me? Plug this back in. I don't know what's happened. Hello? Hello? I don't know what's happened to your ability to hear me.
Okay.
Kelvin, are you there?
Was thinking of
Kelvin, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Do you know what's going on? Can you offer any assistance?
I'm trying to solve that in a second.
In the recording.
Kelvin, are you there?
Yes.
Well, the democracy talks, as I mentioned, are a monthly conversation with activists and individuals who are committed to democracy. We seem to be experiencing some technical difficulties now. I think we've lost contact with our guest, Jamal Mubdi-Bey, and I'm not sure if we should continue, which is going to be difficult with trying without him. Just do it. Whatever we need to do, make it happen. We're trying to get Jamal Mubdi-Bey back online as we ask for your patience. But it's so interesting listening to our different guests' perspective as they share with us their perspective on democracy and the methods and the practices that they have employed to fully participate in our great democracy. We want to invite all of our listening audience to visit us at
Hey, Medina.
Newberry Foundation.
They having a bad connection, Jamal.
Yeah, I know. I can't hear Julius. I'm trying to reconnect.
Where we will have
Okay, well,
different
I'm gonna let you
guests
go. All right, bye.
Okay,
talk
babe.
to us about their perspective as we race toward democracy. So we want to thank you for listening in, for giving us your time, and for supporting the work of the Newberry Foundation. We're located in Hawkinsville, Georgia, 87 Commerce Street in Hawkinsville, Georgia, where we are committed to democracy, be it canvassing, poll watching, postcarding, but not just the practical operation of democracy, but we're interested in organizing, mobilizing. We're interested in giving individuals a platform where they can talk and share the different perspectives that make us the great United States of America. So until next time, thank you for your time and your participation. Be well. God bless you. And again, we salute those in the armed services. We respect and honor our many politicians and civil servants, but most of all, the man and woman in the field who's not just talking about it, but they're being about it. So until next time, I'm your host, Dr. Julius Johnson. We want to thank our esteemed technical team who have been busy behind the scenes bringing this to us all live and in living color. God bless you, God hold you, and God keep you. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much. Signing off.